Good afternoon. I'm Cyrus Taylor, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western Reserve University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Samuel M. Savin SAGES Lecture, sponsored by SAGES and by the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western Reserve. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This afternoon's talk by Michael Schoop, president of the Metropolitan campus of Cuyahoga Community College, belongs to an emerging tradition. Dr. Schoop is here to deliver the third annual Savin Lecture. But I want to point out that we're celebrating another tradition as well. Today also marks the third annual Savin visit, for which we're immensely grateful. Sam Savin, for whom this lecture is named, and his wife Norma return to our campus each spring for this public event. We're delighted by the recurring opportunity to honor Sam for his contribution to the College of Arts and Sciences and for his visionary leadership in creating the SAGES program. Sam and Norma, welcome home. I also want to make a point of personal gratitude to Sam, both for his mentoring of me when he was dean and for his advice and support now that I'm dean. It's immensely valuable. Returning to the subject at hand, SAGES, the seminar approach to general education and scholarship, is the general education curriculum for the entire university. Under the tireless direction of Associate Dean Peter Whiting, SAGES brings students together in small discussion-based seminars that promote active inquiry and the cogent articulation of ideas. SAGES seminars also connect our students with the cultural and scientific resources of University Circle. In a few short years, SAGES has become the signature undergraduate program at Case Western Reserve. The college's leadership role in SAGES began with Sam, and we welcome this chance to again express our gratitude. I mentioned that the SAGES program emphasizes the cogent articulation of ideas. Recently, the Association of American Colleges and Universities recognized SAGES for its commitment to helping students improve their oral communication skills. It's thus especially fitting then to have Dr. Schoop, a specialist in rhetoric, as this year's Savin lecturer. I now ask Peter Whiting to present a more detailed introduction of our guest speaker. Again, thank you all for attending this event.
Yes, thank you for being here. Again, my name is Peter Whiting. I'm the director of SAGES, and I'm pleased, very pleased, to welcome you to this year's Samuel M. Savin SAGES Lecture. I think there's 1 or 2 degrees of separation between Sam and most of us. I was in the department, and Sam played a role in hiring me, perhaps to the regret of some of my colleagues. The Savin Lecture is always someone who has taught in the SAGES program, someone who's been part of our community and who understands our educational philosophy. By inviting Michael Schoop to deliver this afternoon's lecture, we've proudly continued this tradition. Dr. Schoop joined SAGES last fall and led a seminar entitled Reinventing the American City, Cleveland, 1936 to 2036. In this seminar, students reconstructed the city's past, beginning with the Great Lakes Exposition in 1936. They examined the challenges that Cleveland is facing today in the post-industrial era, and importantly, they tried to look forward towards 2036 to imagine a city whose future, they looked forward by studying the city's future by researching areas of economic and community development. Dr. Schoop introduced the students to urban planners, to business leaders, to public officials, including the mayor of Cleveland. Importantly, he encouraged them to use technology as they conducted their research and as they presented their proposals for reinventing the city. It won't surprise me if Dr. Schoop's experiences as a seminar leader helped shape his views he will express in today's lecture, Teaching Imagination in the Age of Digital Experience. Michael Schoop has been president of Cuyahoga Community College's Metropolitan campus since May 2006. He came to Tri-C from the City Colleges of Chicago, where he served as vice president of academic and student affairs and chief academic officer at both Harry S. Truman and Olive Harvey College. Prior to becoming vice president, he spent 5 years as dean of instruction at Truman College and 6 years as a writing instructor at the University of Maryland. Dr. Schoop received his baccalaureate degree from the University of Chicago and both his master's and doctorate from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Michael Schoop as the Samuel M. Savin Sages Lecturer for 2008.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that gracious introduction, and thank you to Dean Taylor for his kind comments, and of course for inviting me to deliver these. I'd also like to acknowledge former President Greg E. Eastwood and the ever-gracious Mr. Arthur Evanchuk, who was instrumental in making the arrangements for today. And of course, Dean Sam Savin, former Dean Sam Savin, for whom these lectures are named. I've been an administrator for about 10 years, and so I have some sense of just how difficult it is to pilot any kind of experiment, let alone one as bold and as sweeping as SAGES. And so I have nothing but the utmost respect for the accomplishment that SAGES represents, and I hope to add some small piece to that legacy. Finally, let me thank all of you for being here this afternoon. My job as a campus president doesn't require me to be a scholar, but it does require that I understand scholarship and scholars. And one of the things I understand that's most basic to scholarship is time, is taking the time to engage in careful research. And so I appreciate you taking a little bit of your precious time to spend with me this afternoon. So, let's start with a familiar concept of education.
You couldn't get me to go back to college if you pointed a gun at me. It isn't that there aren't subjects I wouldn't like to know in college. There's lots of stuff I'd like to know. But what happens is when you sign up for a course that's the most exciting course in the world in your mind, you go and you listen to somebody drone on in a lecture hall like this, and pretty soon you're asleep, and pretty soon you're cutting class, and pretty soon you're wondering why you're there.
Now, let's just say it's not hard to imagine the scene that Roger Shank describes. I like this quote, and I've had it on my computer for an awful long time, because it gets right to the heart of the matter. Roger Shank is a former professor of cognitive science, and now what we might call an academic entrepreneur. And what Shank basically says is, I was one of you, and I'm not buying what you're selling, right? So it's a pretty direct challenge. And I think we ought to accept that challenge and take it seriously and think, what's our response? Particularly when Shank says, you're wondering why you're here. That is one of the signal challenges of our age, of this age for colleges and universities, is to say, what is it I can do here in this place that can't be done somewhere else? Right? So that sense of place, how do we deal with that? Now, not only is it an intellectual challenge, but it really is in some ways a fundamental business challenge, because whether we admit it in most contexts or not, there is a business of education. And in fact, the business of education, if we don't attend to it, we're either deciding that we're going to consign ourselves to irrelevance, or we have so many resources that we don't have to care about it. But most people aren't in those situations. And in fact, far too close to home in Cleveland, we know folks who are challenged with situations that force them to think about the business of education. So we have many contexts in the universities where we maintain the useful fiction, useful and sometimes in fact necessary fiction, that there is no business to education. But in fact, there is a business side, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. But first, let's dwell for just a moment on the scene that Shank imagines, that scene of the professor standing at a lectern with the students in the back delivering a lecture. Now, what's interesting is that this is the default scene for us for teaching, whether it's in a grand place like this or in an ordinary classroom with arm tablet chairs, with a blackboard, right, with a podium. That's the default scene. Now, it's not to say that in the university there aren't other scenes. There, in fact, are. There are laboratories, for example, where people look at microscopes or they deal with sophisticated instruments to do their job. There are places of performance, theaters and studios. But those aren't in the main what we think of when we think of teaching. We think of the default space. And in that default space, there are really just two roles. And it doesn't really take you very long to think about what those roles are. There's the role of the teacher, and there's the role of the student. Right? Now, in fact, that's problematic in all kinds of ways. But what's most important is that it's limiting. It limits what we can think of and what we can imagine in terms of the activities that can take place in that space. As I said, there are other kinds of alternative space, and within those alternatives, if we think about those alternatives, there are other social rules that become available to us. In those spaces, for example, that we call studios. Now, studios are by no means new in education or new in higher education. But in fact, the notion of studio, and in fact the word, studia humanitas, right, is from which we get the study of the humanities and our modern word studio. But embedded in that notion of a studio is not just two roles, but in fact many roles, right? And that's particularly true when we think about modern studios, right? So what would the prototype modern studio look like? What would the prototype modern studio be? Any guesses? Television studio, right? Now, I happen to have the benefit of living with someone who's a television producer, so I have a sort of up-close and personal knowledge of what it takes to create television. And so the kinds of roles that you have available to you in that space are writer, director, researcher, actor, technician of various sorts, right? The roles sort of proliferate. And that model, in fact, is a useful metaphor for thinking about how our notion of what teaching is might be expanded. Now, if I were to stop here and say, well, you'd say that's a nice idea, and it's just theoretical. But in fact, it hasn't been theoretical. There have been people in our business who have tried that model, who have reinvented their classrooms, reimagined their classrooms using the studio model. About a decade ago, Jack Wilson, who is currently the president of the University of Massachusetts system, was then the dean of the physics and engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And Wilson convened this all-star panel, this panel of academic experts in the sciences and engineering, brought them to RPI and asked them to make recommendations about what should happen in the teaching of engineering. And what he expected was what often happens with academic panels. He expected them to come back and have no agreement on what should happen. And to his utter surprise, they came back with very consistent recommendations. They said you should redesign the education so that lecture and lab and recitation, things that are traditionally kept separate, are integrated all in the same space. You should redesign it so that every classroom session is a working session. And at RPI, there came to be a mantra. The mantra was, if you're in a classroom where the professor's doing most of the work and the students are resting, you're in a traditional classroom. And if you're in a classroom where the students are doing most of the work and the professor is resting, it's a studio classroom. Wilson's experiment with studios was a success. It was a success on multiple fronts. It was a success because the feedback that he got from students was that they enjoyed the classes more, they felt more engaged, but their test scores also demonstrated success. They learned more than in traditional classes. But it was also success in the business sense. That is, because Wilson integrated lecture and lab, he reduced the contact hours in the class, and therefore reduced the overall cost of the class for the university. So it turned out to be an extraordinarily successful model. And it was a model that I, in another life, in previous life, had some opportunity to experiment with elsewhere. When I was, some of you know, in my previous life, I spent a decade, and Dean Taylor alluded to it. I spent a decade in Chicago working for the City Colleges system. The last couple of years of my time there was spent engaged with faculty administering a 5-year, $3.5 million grant to redesign classrooms in exactly these ways, right? Using this studio model that has at its center the notion of creativity, at its center the notion of multiple roles for student, not just the student role or the teacher. And so the first task was, of course, to assemble a team of faculty who could do this. A team of faculty who could work together to say, what should the classroom environment look like? What might this, how might this change how we teach on the ground? And two stories, I think, illustrate both the powers of the metaphor, but also some of the challenges of it. The first was I had a meeting with the leader of the group that was from the English department. And we were in my office talking about various plans. In fact, in particular, she was thinking about creating what she called a starter kit for teachers who were entirely unfamiliar with this concept. And so we went back and forth about, well, what ultimately is the goal of this project? What will it look like when we've realized it? And finally, in utter exasperation, she said to me, just tell me what you want. Right? Now, again, as teachers, we've all been in that spot, right, where a student says, what is it you want? And generally, what we're thinking is, what I want you to do is think through this problem. What I want you to do is to apply what you're learning here. And the truth is that what I was hoping for and expecting was not that different. And so what I said to her is, look, I don't know what this is going to turn out to be. And I still don't. But what I do know is if you put smart people in a room together with some resources and some time to think about what they should do, right, that good things will happen. But I want to note that first part of the equation is crucial. That is, smart people in a room together. One of the limitations of the model that we typically use for teaching now is that it is a singular, individual activity, that we are largely isolated from each other in our classrooms. In fact, that's much of the reason why some of us, at least, come into this profession, because you can go into the classroom, close the door, and it's yours. Now, there are great powers to that with teachers who are able to inspire students, who are able, through sheer love of their subject and passion and personality, to bring students along. But there are real weaknesses in the limited connections that you're able to make to everything else that's in the curriculum, and indeed everything else that's outside of the college or the university. So that isolation is a problem. And it's a problem not just intellectually, but in fact it's a practical problem as well. So the notion that we as a default model might begin to think about collaboration as intrinsic to what we do, as opposed to as an add-on to what we do, is part of what the studio implies. There's a second story from my experience experimenting with this kind of innovation that I think also is applicable. And that is, in trying to explain what does this metaphor mean? How might it be played out? I was, in this case, again sitting in my office, but with the chair of the mathematics department. A fascinating woman. Her background actually was, before she came to mathematics, she had headed up a cultural institution in Chicago, was one of its founders. And so she was a person with a wide breadth of experience outside the academic world, and connected to a lot of people for whom creativity was sort of second nature. So I was trying to explain this to her, and I said, imagine, as actually Roger Shank says, imagine the best class in the world in your mind. Okay? Everything goes right. Students come and they're prepared, right? They come to class on time, they do all of the work. They not only answer the questions you ask, but they ask you questions that aren't in the book and aren't on the syllabus. They're perfectly engaged with the subject. Now imagine that you're not the star of that movie, that you're instead the director. How does that change what you do in the classroom? How does that change how you design the classroom? And Helen's response, I think, was very illustrative. She said to me, Michael, I'm not sure I want to be the director. This speaks, I think, to one of the great challenges of moving from our default model to a different way of thinking about teaching, and one that I've not heard very many people talk about. And that is, it's risky. There's risk associated with moving away from what we know how to do, and in many cases do very well, to something we don't know how to do, don't know how it will play out, don't know how students will respond to it, don't know how the dean will respond to the students when they inevitably come to his office to complain, right? And in fact, that sense of anxiety about a new model is well-founded. It's not irrational, right? To go from doing something you're expert at to doing something that you're not only completely inexpert at, but in fact don't know what its end game might be. That's a rational response, right? So it's understandable that there's a certain amount of resistance to saying we could imagine teaching differently. We could use a different teaching model. And yet, given the challenges that we faced, some of which I'll talk a bit more about later, but given the challenges we face, it may well be the case that we need to think more deeply and in a different way about teaching. Now, my ideal class, increasingly, over the years, has come to be this model that I can see in my head and I've seen played out other places. I've experimented with it, I've read about it, and I wanted very much to bring it to my own class. But interestingly enough, when someone says to me, what's your ideal class? Imagine the best class in the world in your head. What comes to mind is not a studio as I've seen it described. What comes to mind is a class I taught 10 years ago. Is a class I taught at Maryland, actually, in advanced prose style. The students in this class, as I said, were ones who anticipated your questions, or one who produced things that were truly surprising and remarkable and fresh, despite the fact that I had been teaching this subject for probably 5 or 6 years at that point. So it's the kind of class where you walk out of the class and you say, maybe I can teach after all, right? And that, I think, increasingly as we teach, is the case, that the best class in your mind is maybe not the class you taught before, but the class you've already taught. Sorry, not the class you're going to teach, but the class you already taught, right? That class that everything worked just perfectly and every subsequent class never quite measures up, right? So we're all subject to that. So I had this idea class in my head when I began planning and ultimately began teaching my SAGES seminar last fall. And so here was this ideal class, and here was the reality of the SAGES class. And one of my students is here. I'm sure she'll tell you there was a gap between the ideal and the reality. Actually, two of my students are here. So there was this gap between the ideal and the reality. And part of what describes that gap, I think, is revealed in what happened in the very last class. As you heard, we had a number of guest speakers, okay? Some of whom were political leaders, some of whom were planners, some of whom were experts in urban design. The very last class, the culmination of the class, was our meeting with the mayor. And so there we all are, all the students sitting around the table in the red room, as it's called, with the mayor. And the mayor is talking about talent attraction, talking about how do you bring people to Cleveland and keep them here. And he said, this generation of young people need to touch it and taste it and feel it. And that should have been the explicit principle, design principle for the class, to create an experience where they touch it, taste it, and feel it. So in a sense, the mayor was clearer about our design principle than we were. And it sort of all came to a head in that moment. What we had wanted was this highly interactive, reflective class where students had an opportunity to be in the world of the city, in all of its cultural richness, to grapple with its problems with people who were truly charged with solving them, and then to bring that back and reflect on it. And what they got was basically a lecture discussion class with some field trips. I think we can do better than that. In fact, I'm sure that we can do better than that. But I think part of doing better is, as I said before, taking as our default model the notion that your class is not just your class. Taking as the default, part of the default model that we have to work together to create an experience for students. But one of the things I want to point out is that as much as studios imply that you need a team of people to work together as teachers, it also implies that students are an integral part of that team. And one of the questions you want to ask yourself is, what do they bring to that team? Right? What set of skills? Because of course every team is defined by a set of roles and a set of skills that inhere in those roles. I would argue that what they bring to the team, first and foremost, is not a set of technical skills, but a set of cultural skills. That is, that they are, in some ways, heirs to an educational revolution. The introduction you heard by Roger Shank is an introduction to an ebook where he argues for the use of computers, for the use of technology. That's not a new argument. There are lots of people who have been engaged in that argument. In fact, it's not even computers as the technology is not even a new argument. There have been arguments about the use of technologies throughout much of this century. And much of that argument hinges on whether this technology or that will promote a transformation and a revolution. One of the things I want to suggest is that we should consider the possibility that the revolution in education isn't about to happen, but in fact happened already. That really since about the 1960s, much of the free time, particularly that Americans, but really across cultures, much of the free time that we have gained, right, in changing work schedules has been absorbed by television and increasingly other media. Right? And that the pervasiveness of those media, particularly digital media, have acculturated less our generation than other generations that sort of grew up with it as transparent. To think about the world in ways that are different from the ways that we think about it. And those understandings, that intuitive sense of how media work, of how they are manipulated, of, in other words, a broader, what one might call digital rhetoric, are what students of this generation bring to the classroom. Rhetorician Richard Lanham has called this reshaping our attention structures, right? Using various media to focus our attention, to capture our attention, and to sustain it, right? And that's one of the things that a reimagined classroom may give us the opportunity to do. There are two things that connect this notion of the restructured classrooms to the structure of the universities. Because what often happens in these kinds of cases where we say, let's transform classroom teaching, we don't take into account there's a larger university that we have to keep in mind. But I would call our attention to two things that do that. The first is the pressure of economics and technology. On this issue, let me quote Eli Noem, who is the faculty member chair of the teleinformation at Columbia University. Noem says, scholarly activity, viewed dispassionately, consists primarily of three elements: the creation of knowledge and evaluation of its validity, the preservation of information and the transmission of this information to others. Accomplishing each of these the preservation of information and the transmission of the information to others. Accomplishing each of these functions is based on a set of technologies and economics. Together with history and politics, they give rise to a set of institutions. Change the technology and the economics, and the institutions must change inevitably. Inevitably. That is to say, the last 100 years of our institutions are built on the technology of lecture, on the technology of mass production. So what we have is, at the core of our institutions, a kind of medieval craft guild, and layered on top of that, an industrial structure that's economics depends on mass production, essentially on scale, and lowering price based on scale, and surrounded by a cultural context of digital media. So all that sort of sits on the outside of our core business, as it were. Now, I'm not one who's given much to reading business books or to recommending business books, but there is one that I've read recently that I think actually speaks to the issues that we have in higher education, in colleges and in universities. I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to read Good to Great, Jim Collins' book, that has summarized. One of the things that's most impressive about it is that it summarizes a tremendous amount of empirical data. And the question it asks is, companies that achieve superior performance over the long haul, and in his case, the long haul is certainly not academic time, but it's long enough, it's 15 years. So achieving superior performance over 15 years in any business is not a trivial achievement. He boils the core principles of companies that make that leap from being good at what they do to being great to three things. He says you have to ask three questions. You have to ask, what drives your economic flywheel? In other words, what's the core business? What can you be the best in the world at? And what are you passionate about? And I think in some sense, those speak to the institutional moment we're at. And I'd like to frame them with what I see as parallel rhetorical questions, because I think we live in an age that calls for us to position ourselves using the tools of rhetoric. Aristotle talks about there are three elements to being an effective orator. And to my mind, they sound very much like Collins's three elements. They are phronesis, practical wisdom, arete, excellence, right? All of the human excellences, and eunoia, creating good feeling with the audience. And what for me this implies, not in the context of business, but in the context of our culture, in the context of colleges and universities, is a change in character. It's a change in how we imagine who we are. And what that change may emerge from is by setting aside the arguments about whether technology can transform education or not. And saying to ourselves, quite honestly, we don't know. But the way that we may find out is by entering in the spirit of inquiry that is central to our enterprise, the part of what we do that is also at its economic heart, namely teaching, and treat it as a mode of inquiry, but also as an activity that has at its center creativity. That what we do in classrooms, that the classrooms therefore become a site of producing knowledge. Because in fact, classrooms are one of the places we know the least about. As I said, you shut the door and it's yours, and no one knows what happens there. But we could change that. And thinking about and imagining what we do differently and exploring the limits of our imagination may allow us to do that. Thank you very much.
Well, I didn't work this out ahead of time, but I'm hoping that Michael will take a few questions. So,
Absolutely.
what questions would you have? Come on up, Michael.
Sure. Yes, sir.
With computers, there's the ability for self-directed learning. And also, if it's not self-directed necessarily, it can be at a different pace.
Yes.
So that people who grasp ideas, concepts, so on, can progress.
Yes.
How do you integrate people who learn at varying, who have different abilities and learn at varying rates and so on within a large group of people, either in a seminar or in a class, using technology?
Using technology. If I may, I'd like to argue a bit in the academic way with the premise of your question. What your question assumes, and I see this if you looked at the Chronicle today, there was a whole, or probably yesterday, there was a whole section on faculty using technology in their classrooms, and the phrase you hear used repeatedly is integrating technology into the classroom. What I'm suggesting to you is that integrating the technology into the classrooms assumes that there is a classroom model and that we have to put technology in it, as opposed to saying, think about the classroom in a way that makes it a space where technology is absolutely integral to the activity. In other words, redesign the activity, right? And you don't have to think about how to use computers. And again, I go back to the example of my wife. It would be absurd to say, let's integrate technology into movie production. Yeah, that's what you have to do, right? And so as long as we frame the question as we have a set curriculum, and we have to teach that curriculum, and some people will go more quickly through it, and some people will go more slowly through it, then it will always seem that the answer will be, well, how do we speed up the ones who are slow, or how do we slow down the ones who are going too quick? As opposed to saying, if we're engaged in an activity like this one, for example, And we have somebody who has a set of technical skills, and we have somebody who presumably has a set of oratorical skills, and we have somebody else who has a skill at facilitation. All of those people aren't doing the same thing, but using all of the things that they bring to the situation, you can actually create an event that is more successful than if we say everybody's got to do the same thing at the same time. Try and do real work in the classroom as opposed to say the classroom is to internalize a particular set curriculum. I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but yes. Hi.
You seem to say two things which I really caught on to.
Okay.
On the one hand, you say students of today are looking for, they need to taste it, they need to see it, they need to feel it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we're arguing for using technology
Yeah.
to increasingly mediate and hence shape that information. So it seems like,
That is their experience, is I guess what I'm arguing.
do you see the contradiction there though?
No, actually I don't. That is, mediated experience is still experience. Now, can we taste things on the internet? No, but we can certainly see them and we can certainly hear them, and in fact, we can certainly feel them. Right? It had the classic example of this, again, in popular culture is we all go to movies, some of which make us cry. We feel mediated experiences. So we haven't gotten to smell and taste yet, but I have no doubt that it eventually will get there. But the truth is we haven't used the power of the tools that we have, even though we have whole generations of people who've been deeply acculturated to them. Yes, sir.
Now, I was interested in the question of why the math chair would rather be an actress than a director.
I'm sorry? Oh, the math chair. Yeah.
Why do you think that means?
Well, what I suggest that it means is the reluctance that all of us have to step out of roles that are familiar. I think that's in fact what she was saying, is that, you know, she knows people who are directors, but she didn't know how to be a director. And so in that case, you could say, I can't blame you for not wanting to be a director if you don't really feel like you know how to be a director. And this happens all the time with the technical part of using computers, for example, in a classroom. That is, again, quite rightly, faculty members will say, you know, you want me to use these computers in the classroom, but then you give me no help. I don't know how to, you know, set this stuff up. That's not what I do. And that's a reasonable answer. I think it was simply the case that her answer in some ways was more profound, in the sense that she wasn't talking about lacking a set, I don't believe, lacking a set of technical skills. She was really talking about a certain identity that she wasn't really ready to assume. And that's not a trivial barrier for us, I think. Yes, sir.
Following up on Peter's question and your answer,
Sure.
in your experience,
Mm-hmm.
or do you feel that we can't move in the directions that we've talked about with the cast of characters that we call professors? Because they are motivated to kind of profession for
And because he's not dean, he can answer that. He can ask that question, right? No, actually, I don't believe it's the case that we can't move there with a cast of characters. What I tried to say, and what I will say more explicitly here, is that we can't move there individually with the cast of characters. Let me give you another little story from my experiments with this kind of model. After about a year of working together as a team, I had a couple of faculty members run up against a scheduling problem. You've all seen these, where, you know, everybody wants to be in this room, everybody wants to be in that room, and you just can't get everybody in. And I had one faculty member come up to me and say, I can never go back to teaching the other way. That wasn't an accomplishment. That wasn't an individual achievement. That was a collective achievement. It was by their collective experience. It was by their working together and pushing each other that they were able to invent a different way of teaching that they wouldn't have by themselves. And I believe there are other kinds of problems with my class, but I believe my failure with the SAGES class, and I want to stress, it wasn't a failed class in the sense that I don't think the students got anything out of it, and these guys will tell you better whether they got anything out of it or not. But I think its failure to achieve what we thought it could achieve was in part a result of ignoring that fact, that to create this kind of engaged experience, you can't do it by yourself. And part of the challenge is that our profession is a deeply individualistic profession. It's one of the reasons it's so hard to run a department, let alone run an entire college. So, but in fact, that can be overcome with time and experience. That is, you can't argue it into place. You can't give people research that says this works better. That won't get you there. What will get you there is placing people in a context where the only way they can get the job done, and that's the other thing, that's the other thing we've got going for us, is that we have high achievers. We have people who hate to fail. And so if you put them in a context where the only way that they can get the job done is by working together, they'll get it done. They'll reinvent their teaching. Yes, sir. Yes, I do know that. Yes. Yes.
A lot of people find it really, really terrifying, I think, to try something different.
Yes, absolutely.
After 25 years learning to do a certain thing. So I was wondering if you had some thoughts about the people and the courage to try it.
Yes.
And also at the same time the possibility that you might end up saving time, which I believe is true.
It is in fact true. It is in fact true. To go back to the example from RPI, there was really an institutional decision to reduce the overall amount of contact time that had previously been built into lectures and labs. So, I mean, it's quite literally the case that they save time there programmatically. But in fact, one of the things that the faculty at the city colleges discovered is that once you had reached that threshold, once you had gone up the learning curve, that things got a lot easier because you had designed things that the term that's often used for this is the learning objects. You had designed things that could be reused in different contexts. You had designed scenarios that could be reused in different contexts. There are other parts of that scheme and that model that were particular that also saved time. President Eastwood, for example, was asking about students who might be falling behind in a class. One of the parts of the schemes that we designed in Chicago was support in the classroom. That is, we had a kind of student, unlike the students who are at Case, who weren't residential, and so for them, time was an issue too. And the greatest point of institutional contact for them was the classroom. That was the place we could reliably find them. And so one of the things we did is redesign services so that they could be delivered as a touch point directly in the classroom. So this happens, and this probably happens here too, though to a lesser degree. Virtually every good teacher who's been teaching for a little while, first week of class, you can kind of figure out who's going to be okay and who's going to have some trouble with the class. Right? Every good teacher I know does that, and particularly teachers who are at community colleges pay attention to that because they don't want to lose their students. But because there's a crush of activity at the beginning of the semester, it's rarely the case that you can do anything about it, or very much, because there are so many other things pulling at you. And so one of the ways that we address that is by creating what was called a student services liaison. And so faculty member was able to say, okay, these 3 people, you need to make sure that they get to the tutoring office. And then that person would report back to the faculty member and say, yep, they got to the tutoring office. And so close the loop. That was part of the design of the system, but that particular design came out of the faculty collaborating and saying, here's what's missing here. Here's what you need to do to make this work. So institutional changes actually emerged from the faculty design of the experience and what they wanted it to be. And I would cite that as one kind of example of time saving that you were talking about. But yeah, I think you're entirely right. I think there's time savings to be had on the teaching side, and I think there's time saving to be had on the way that we provide services. But I also think it's very possible. I have not seen evidence that this is true in most cases yet. But I think it's also possible that we might just begin to focus our attention on how long it takes us, or how long it takes our students to learn things. That might also be an area of time savings. Because right now, we have an economic model that is basically built on, right, the amount of time, right? Students get get credit for time, right? Faculty members get paid based on their contact time, right? And that's the heart of the economic model. Now, it's interesting to note what that leaves out, right? What's of value, presumably, is learning. And that's not a measure at all. It's not linked to the economics of it at all. And the interesting thing is that recently, in the last year or so, we've seen a report from the Spellings Commission that has begun to talk about the drumbeat of accountability. But it's accountability after the fact. It's accountability completely separated from the core of the enterprise. And I think one of the things that we have the opportunity to do by reimagining the classroom is to provide an entirely different kind and a different level of accountability. People have no idea what test scores mean in most cases. On the other hand, if you said, I took Professor Savin's class, here's what was on the syllabus, here's an example of my work, here's how he judged the work, most of us could make reasonable judgments about whether that work actually made sense and was graded fairly. We have the ability to do that. We would just need to design environments in which it was routine. If it was a one-off and you were designing it yourself, or I was designing it myself, maybe in a couple of years. But if you have a team of people and they have support from the dean here, then you can get it done in a much shorter time. Sure.
One last question, or are we done?
Yes, ma'am. Probably the best way that we can help a student who has anxiety about lecture, and the truth is that for most people, hearing information is probably the second or third best way for them to receive information. So probably the best way to help a student like that, my guess would be to redesign the classes so that they're engaged in activity in the classroom. And that activity is highly structured, and therefore the role of the faculty member would rely less on transmitting information and more on guiding that activity, or in some cases directing that activity in a meaningful way. Now we have examples of this. We have models of this, for example, where a class is about directing a play. Right? And we know what that looks like, and we know what people should be doing in that context. We just need to find ways to apply that model and that metaphor in other classroom situations, I think. Does that make sense?